In this video, I'm going to talk all about paint. I'm going to go ahead and give you a few essential tips which will help you mix your paint better, and that will in turn help you improve your airbrushing. Let's get into it right now. So the tips that I'm going to share with you in this video are going to relate to water-based paints. The two that I've got pictured here, the Trident and Createx illustration colors, are the two brands of paint that I prefer using. You can apply the same sort of tips that I share with you in this video to the brand of paint that you're using. So tip number one, which is extremely obvious, but most people will overlook this, is simply shake your paint before you do anything with it. So depending on what paint you're using, and it may not be a ready-made airbrush paint like the Trident or the Createx, then you'll need to thin it down. And the easiest way to explain how thin to go with your paint in order to get it to atomize through your airbrush is that I recommend thinning it to a milky consistency. With Trident, I use their reducer to thin it out, and I have different ratios for different purposes, but I'll get into that a bit later in this video. If the paint that you're using is maybe something different and not a ready-made paint, then you could use an airbrush medium or thinner from another company to thin it out. I'd always recommend doing a spray test first before using it on your artwork to make sure that they're compatible and that they're working well together and that the viscosity of your paint is not compromised. I also recommend do not use water to thin out your paint. So use the recommended reducer or thinner or airbrush medium, depending on which brand you're going for and what type of paint it is. Okay, so let's say you've mixed up your paint and it's running at about 20 PSI. And you can hear that the airbrush is struggling. You're also getting a lot of tip drying, which you can see the paint there dried up on the end of the needle. A couple of things can be causing this. And the first thing I would do to try and remedy the issue, you can see I can't even pull out a nice line, is I would turn the pressure up. So I'm currently working at about 20 PSI. I'm going to step that up to 35. I'm not going to adjust the thickness of the paint at this stage. I'm going to try and fix the issue by just increasing the air pressure. Okay, so now with the air pressure turned up, you can definitely hear the difference. It's definitely pushing that paint through, and I'm getting a little bit of better performance, but it's still not optimal. You can see I can almost get a line out of it, but it's still a bit splattery. So that's telling me now the only thing that's left to do is to add some reducer to the paint. So I've thinned out this existing color. I actually sprayed that one straight out of the bottle, so I didn't mix it to a milky consistency. But now that I have it at a milky consistency, you can see it's flowing a lot nicer and perfect sort of mix for that air pressure. So that's the other thing. I'm still running at a bit of a higher pressure, and this sort of 1-to-1 mix, which is the approximate ratio that I'm working at now, is flowing really nicely with that PSI. See, depending on what paint you're using, you've got to find that sweet spot. Okay, so let's say now when you're painting, this happens, where it's spidering out on you, very hard to get fine detail. This tells me that the paint's way too thin, and the reason that it's spidering out is because you can use thin paint, however you would need to then reduce the pressure to compensate. So that's what I'm going to do first. So just like when it was too thick, I increased the PSI. I am now going to lower the PSI to about 18 PSI and see if this thinner paint will run through okay at that pressure. Okay, so now working at the 18 PSI, you can see I'm able to get nice fine detail even with this 0.35mm needle nozzle setup in the Iwata Eclipse. It will mean that when I'm doing a heavier coat, I need to do numerous coats to get coverage and to get that sort of intensity. But as far as flow is concerned, the airbrush is running beautifully at that PSI and paint mix. So I think after those two demonstrations, you now know how to adjust your paint and try and get that mix accurate. Now, if you want to do a complete deep dive into my mixing ratios, I'm going to link up a video in the description. It looks like this. So that's the thumbnail, but I'll put the link in the description for you so you can check that one out. So that's going to explain to you my mixing ratios in a lot more detail. To give you a quick summary of what I use. So for my general airbrushing, I use a mixing ratio of 1:1, so equal parts paint and reducer, and I run my PSI at about 30 to 40 PSI. So for detailed airbrushing, I'll run my ratio at 30% paint, 70% reducer, and I'll drop my PSI down to 18 to 20 PSI. Now the question that I always get asked is, even if I don't have airbrush paint, can I thin it out and use it through an airbrush? Well, yes you can, and like I said at the start of this video, as long as it's a milky consistency, you can pretty much try any sort of paints. So you definitely want to test it first. Once you've mixed it up, do some spray outs and make sure that it's mixing correctly and that the viscosity is not compromised. You'll know straight away if it's going to perform or not. So if you want to learn more, why not check out our online airbrushing course at airbrushasilum.thinkific.com. And if you found this video helpful, then why not check out some of the other videos and playlists that I've got listed here. And until next time, go grab your airbrush, do some amazing artwork yourself, and I'll see you again very, very soon in the next video. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.